Are you looking to learn how to resistance band squat with the absolute best form? Well, if so, then I've got you covered in this resistance band squat tutorial. Welcome to Total Body Training. My name is Jean Carlos. And if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, then please click the subscription button. On this channel, we go over fitness tips, trends, and tutorials to help you stay informed and get in shape. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you don't like this video, give it a thumbs down. Today, we're gonna go over 3 things. First, we're gonna go over the main muscle groups that you work out when squatting. Second, a tutorial where I break down exactly how to do the squat. And then finally, third, we're gonna go over the most common mistakes when squatting with the resistance band. So what are the major muscle groups you work out when squatting? First, squatting is a compound movement. You're going to feel compound exercises like the squat in many muscle groups throughout your body. I'm gonna break this down by explaining the main muscle group you should feel and then some other minor muscle groups that you'll also feel it in indirectly. The primary muscle group you should be feeling your squats in is your quads. The quads are the front muscle across the top of your leg, and it can be broken up into smaller little sections. Your quads are the main muscle group that's at the top of your leg, as you can see right here. You're also going to feel your squat in secondary muscle groups that get stimulated when you're squatting, but they're not really the main muscle groups that you should be feeling your squat in. The first one is your glutes. Now, when you squat, because you're using your leg, your glutes, they're attached to your leg, you're naturally going to feel some kind of activation in your glutes. Now, there are certain kinds of squats that activate your glutes more than others. So here I'm teaching a standard squat with my feet just facing slightly out. But let's say that we switch to doing a goblet squat or a plie squat. We might feel those squats a lot more in our thighs and our glutes than the regular squat that we're doing here. Also, it's important to activate your glutes, so that means squeeze them when you're doing your movement so that you get more stability in your squat. It just helps in the process. The next muscle group that you activate when squatting is your hamstrings. Now, your hamstrings are in the back part of your leg, like you can see in this diagram right here. And the hamstrings really aren't the major muscle group. Like I said, the quads are the main one you're gonna feel, but because you're moving and using your entire leg, because it's a compound movement, you can't not activate your hamstrings. Now, I will say that if you're trying to improve your hamstrings, your best bet is to switch over to a hamstring compound movement, like say a deadlift, and then also make sure that you're including a hamstring isolation exercise, like say a lying hamstring curl. The combination of those two movements really activate your hamstrings way more than squatting does, but you're still gonna feel it somewhat, because you can't not feel it. You're, after all, using your entire leg. If you're new to squatting and you're just now starting to squat, chances are you feel it everywhere throughout your legs. You probably have so much soreness from squatting, if you're doing it right, that you can't separate your quad pain from your hamstring pain or from your glute pain. It's just all going to get activated. The next muscle group that you're going to feel your squat in is your calves. If you're very new to training, your little muscle groups in your calves and your feet get activated so much when you're carrying weight, when you're doing things that you can't not feel them. It's just something that instantly happens in the process. You know, again, if you're wanting to activate your calves more, you're gonna wanna switch over to doing a calf specific exercise like a calf raise. It's not like squatting is necessarily going to make your calves get super jacked. You've gotta do something separate to isolate those and really activate those. The major muscle group that you should be feeling your squat in is always going to be your quads, but you're going to feel activation and you're sometimes going to want to intentionally induce activation in these other muscle groups to help you out with your form and your technique when doing a resistance band squat. Next, we're gonna do a tutorial about how to actually resistance band squat. You're going to go ahead and take your band, your resistance band, and place it on the floor or maybe hold it in your hands. But either way, you're going to wanna step into the resistance band with the sole part of your foot on top of the resistance loop band. So you don't want the band to sit on your heels because it'll probably come out when you're doing the exercise or not feel very comfortable. And you also don't want it on your toes because it just doesn't work so well. It's gonna pull you forward way too much when you're doing the movement. So make sure it's across your sole. So let's talk about your foot placement. When you go up to the band, you're going to step into the band and you're gonna turn your toes out to about 30 degrees, pointing with your toes pointing out and your knees also pointing towards your toes, out in opposite directions. And your hips and your feet sitting at about hip distance, if not just a little bit outside of your hips for stability purposes. From there, you're going to grab your band and bring it up to the top part of your chest below your chin. And from here, we're gonna talk a little bit about how much give we want in the band. So if you notice at the beginning of this, I've got a lot of slack in my resistance band. And the more slack you've got, so the more dangly part that you've got hanging on your resistance band on the opposite end, the more tension you're going to have in your band as you're going down, because you're limiting the range of motion that the band has. And so this is gonna make it slightly harder. If you leave less slack in your resistance band, you're gonna feel it less when you're doing it. If you're new to working with the resistance band, I recommend holding less slack in the resistance band so that you can go down a little bit more easily when you're learning the movement. Or if you are still feeling like no matter what you do or how much slack you put in your resistance band, you can't get enough tension in the band, you might wanna switch to using a band that's a little bit thicker. A heavier weight band will activate your quads more because you're putting more resistance on yourself. In these videos, I typically use a lighter band because it's easier for me to teach the movement when I'm using a lighter band, because I do so many reps that I just get burnt out. So I like to use something a little bit smaller, but you'll have to find something that's right for you. Once you're holding your band in between your hands, you're going to push your chest out and pinch your shoulder blades. So you're gonna kind of have this, what I would call a proud chest, where your chest is out and upright and your shoulder blades are back. We could just say this is like exaggeratedly good posture, or I like to call this proud chest or Johnny Bravo chest. So if you've ever seen that cartoon from the early 2000s called Johnny Bravo, he'd always have his chest out kind of like he was showing off. And really the reason for this is going to help keep your body more upright when you're going down in the movement. And if you're struggling to understand how to do this, I'm literally just packing my lat muscles, my back muscles, and pushing them back and pushing my chest out. That way I'm straight as opposed to being slouched over. From this position, you're going to go ahead and squat. Make sure that your whole body is very tight and go ahead and squat all the way down till your hip crease falls below your knee and then come up. Go all the way down, making sure that you get nice and low, keeping your chest and muscles very tight, and then come straight up. I'm gonna let the video run here. We're gonna show this from a couple of different angles. Lastly, let's talk about the most common mistakes that people make when squatting. The first mistake is not squatting low enough. There could be a variety of reasons for people not squatting low enough, and one of the main things that I've seen as a trainer for over 8 years is that some people have been told that if you squat below parallel, like you see right here, it's somehow bad for your knees. And I just want to clarify this, that it's not bad for your knees. That's based on some bogus study that was made in like the 1960s and it's since been debunked. So ignore that, anybody who's telling you that. It's okay for you to squat below parallel unless there are some pre-existing issues, like say in your spine or in your quads or in your knees, some kind of issue that prohibits you from doing that. Or if you're just insanely tight and you can't get low enough, squatting below parallel or even at parallel might be challenging for you, but in most situations, most people should be able to build up to that. What we really want to make sure that we're doing is that we're squatting low enough that your hip crease falls below your knees, so that your femur is at a slight angle. If this is your glute area, your knee would be up here. So we want to be at an angle as opposed to going parallel or having your glutes way above your knees, way up here. We want to make sure that we're dropping low enough that we get proper activation in our quads. So let's say that you are trying to squat lower, but you can't get low enough, like you see me doing in this video. It could be for one of the following reasons, and those are some things that we can fix kind of quickly. The first one could be that your feet are too close together. Remember earlier when we were talking about that Olympic squat? For some of us, our hips don't have the kind of mobility to be able to go straight down in your squat and come back up. And you can see some video of me doing that right here, where it just looks really ugly. There is a myth that you absolutely always have to squat with your feet facing forward. And squatting with your feet facing forward can be challenging for some people. And the reason for that is that if you squat with your feet facing forward and you have tight hips, you oftentimes will find that you can't get low enough in your squat in order to get proper activation in your quads when you're doing the movement. And so just switching over to what we would call a starting strength squat, that's a Mark Ripito reference. If you don't know who that is, you can look him up on YouTube. And turning your toes out to about 30 degrees and standing just a hair wider might give your tight hips, hamstrings, and glutes a little bit more mobility and flexibility to drop down lower in your squat. I've been training people for over 8 years, and I have found that this method works for most people. The minority of people do a great squat that goes below parallel with their feet facing forward, at least in my experience. What we're going to want to do instead is just take a slightly wider stance, maybe with your feet just a little bit outside of your hips or underneath. You can kind of play with this range. It's different from person to person based off of your hip mobility and your strength in your legs and your time and experience, and it might even be something that you change as you get more experienced. But either way, find a place that's good for you, and then make sure that you're turning your toes out to about 30 degrees. Something about the turning of your toes out externally rotates your hips and gives your hips the proper depth and the proper space for you to drop down all the way. Let's say that the reason you can't get low when you're squatting is simply out of fear. Maybe you just feel like you're gonna fall back. It's entirely understandable if you feel that way and you don't want to get hurt in the gym or just look silly. So what you can do instead is take a box or a bench or a chair that is about the depth that you want to go down for your squat, and you're going to set up just like you're doing your squat, the exact same position, and sit back and sit your weight entirely onto the box, completely resting your weight onto it and then standing back up. And you can do this several times in order to get used to the sensation of it. Now, you might want to also ditch your resistance band in order to get the technique down. So you might want to just do this with body weight like you see me doing here, because this can really help you get used to that sensation, because at first it can feel like you're just gonna flop down onto the box or the bench, and that can be a little bit scary. And I also strongly recommend that you get something that's very sturdy. That's why I use this box. I wouldn't use like a basic chair in my house unless you have a really strong chair. I wouldn't necessarily use that. I want something that makes my body feel very stable when I'm resting all of my weight repeatedly onto it, kind of in an aggressive way like you do with your squat. The next common mistake is inconsistent squat depth. I see this one a lot when I'm training people. And so this just means that maybe you've got a really great squat, you go below parallel, you take your body through its full range of motion, but you're inconsistent about when you're going to full range of motion and when you're not. So maybe sometimes you're up in a quarter squat position, and then when you feel like it, you go down lower. And then maybe when you're not cool with going down lower, you start to go parallel. And there could be a couple of reasons for this. The first thing is that it could be entirely possible that you are unaware of whether or not you're squatting low enough, or whether or not you're inconsistent with your squat. So there are a couple ways that you could fix that. The first thing is just slowing things down and connecting with yourself. So if you are coming up on a squat day and you're gonna focus on that, tell yourself before you even go into the gym that you're gonna give yourself some time to really focus on this one movement, so that in the future you can do it more effectively. Let's say that you think you're doing this, but you don't know how to make that mind-muscle connection. So you're not really sure if you're squatting to depth. You could record yourself just using your phone and see how your reps look each and every time. It could entirely be the case that you're squatting perfectly fine. And then finally, I just want to say that practice makes perfect, or at least practice makes things a lot better. If you're having inconsistencies with your squats, sometimes it could just be that you find yourself getting really fatigued when you're squatting, or perhaps you find that the movement itself is just really, really difficult. And so this is going to take some practice. Now, if you're squatting with weight, like a barbell, or you're squatting with the resistance bands or something like that, and you find that the band is just making it way too hard for you to use to go down to depth, then chances are whatever you're using, the device that you're using, in this case the resistance band, is too heavy for you to use. So you might have to go back down to basics like squatting without a resistance band or without a barbell or without dumbbells in order to fix your squat, get it consistent, and then add on the resistance bands. The next common mistake is pronating your knees. That's just a fancy way of saying buckling your knees in. Some pronation is okay, but excessive amounts of it cannot be so good because it creates a lot of instability. And so what we want to do instead of pronating is we want to set up with our feet facing slightly out and making sure that our knees are pointing towards our toes. It could entirely be the case that if you're very flexible through your legs, your knees could be facing like this and your feet could be facing out. So make sure to externally rotate your thighs, activate your quads, push your legs out so that your knees are tracking and going towards your toes while you're squatting. And so on the way down, just make sure that your knees are going towards your toes on the way down rather than sitting on the inside. And this requires you to, again, push your quads and your thighs out at the bottom. If you're struggling with pronation when you're coming up and out of your squat, what you're going to need to do is on the way up, actively push your legs apart and push your knees out. It's almost gonna feel like exaggerated in the beginning because it's gonna feel like you're really trying to push your legs apart. But in reality, if you're doing this right, what's going to happen is it's going to even out. Let's say you're trying to fix your pronation, but no matter what you do, you can't fix it. The next thing that I'd recommend doing is ditching the band and trying to do your squats without it and seeing if you still pronate. And if you're pronating when you're not using the bands, or if you're pronating when you're not using the bands, then we need to stay without any kind of weight or resistance for a while to learn the technique and really get it down before including the bands. The next common mistake is rounding your spine. So when you're going down into your squat, sometimes you're going to feel like the resistance band is going to pull you forward. And naturally what happens is that you start to do this rounding effect with your upper back, which isn't so good because you can throw your back out in some situations. And so what you're gonna wanna do is instead pinch your shoulder blades back, activate your lat muscles, which are your back muscles near your shoulder blades, and keep this very proud chest. You can also call this a Johnny Bravo chest is what I jokingly call it if you've ever seen that cartoon from back in the early 2000s. And you're gonna have your chest pushed out and your lats packed and your muscles in your upper back tight. This is going to make it so that as you're squatting, your upper back stays more arched and pushed out rather than rounded. The next one is doing a good morning squat. Good mornings are very similar to a deadlift. They're a hamstring exercise, they're a hip hinge exercise that activates your hamstrings. But when you're squatting, because we wanna make sure that we're activating the quads, we wanna make sure that we're going down as straight as possible. And also when we're coming up, we're trying to come back up as straight as possible. With the good morning squat, what happens is that someone will go down very straight, their body will be tight, but then their butt will come up first, and then they'll straighten themselves out. Just like you see right here. The butt comes up first, and then they straighten themselves out at the top of the movement. And that's a good way to throw out your low back, or just get crunched under weight. So this wouldn't necessarily be the case with the resistance band, but if you were using a barbell, it could just push you and smash you down, and you don't really wanna get tacoed that way. And so what we're going to want to do is instead keep that proud chest, like I mentioned earlier, keep your lats packed and tight and down. As you go down into this squat, make sure your body's tight. And as you come up, you're going to want to feel like you're pushing your upper back up to the sky first and not your hips first. And you're going to go down and come up with your upper back first and your chest and your head first rather than your hips first. You might need to practice this movement without using a band at first because it's very tricky. So you're going to need to practice this quite a bit. It's actually a problem that sometimes can come up after you've been squatting for a while and you start to make your squats harder. So this actually happened to me when I was squatting very heavy. I was starting to get to a point where I was getting stronger and the weight that I was using was actually pushing me down and I was coming up with my hips early naturally. And so what you're gonna wanna do is practice this frequently and also record yourself to see if you're making this mistake. And eventually with time, you'll be able to fix it. But you're always going to wanna go with a lighter resistance band or a lighter weight to fix these problems. The next one is coming up on your toes when you're squatting. So this one is actually extremely common, and sometimes it has to do with how tight your calves are. So maybe you don't have a lot of flexibility through your calves and that's what's causing the issue. So in that instance, you're going to need to work a lot on technique and stretching your body and getting more used to the squat with good form and good technique. But 9 times out of 10, it has something to do with how you're placing your feet as you're doing your squat. So one of the most common reasons that people come up on their toes is that they'll try to take a very narrow stance. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes this isn't right for everybody. And in addition to that, someone will stand with their feet facing very close and your feet facing forward, and then they'll try to go as low as they possibly can. And instantly, because they don't have the hip mobility or the calf or leg flexibility, they just lean forward onto their toes, and that can eventually knock you forward or just not be very balanced when you're doing the movement. And so what you're gonna wanna do is instead start off by going back to the basics and turning your toes out to 30 degrees and standing just a hair wider. Not a really wide stance like a sumo squat, just a little bit wider, a little bit outside of your hips. You're gonna need to play a little bit with your squat distance and find a placement that feels right for you and your feet. From there, what you're gonna wanna do is ditch the resistance band and once you're in that position on the ground with your feet facing out, you're gonna wanna feel your toes and you're gonna wanna pay attention to how your foot feels on the ground. So literally pay attention to the outer and the upper edges of your toes, the outer and the inner edges of your feet and your heels on the ground. Once you've made that connection, start to practice going down in your squat and making sure that you feel the entirety of your foot, with the exception of your arch, unless your feet are flat, with the exception of your arch touching the floor. The moment that you start to feel like your heels are coming up, start to push and drive your heels back down to the ground. Or if your toes are coming up, push them down onto the ground. Something that can really help you with this is taking off your shoes. I'm a big fan of this. This is actually how I learned to do my best squats. And the reason I say that is because when we take off our shoes, we can actually feel the ground. Some pairs of shoes have all this cushion in them and can be really comfy, and that can be great, but can also be a hindrance when you're actually trying to make a connection between your foot and the floor. And so when you ditch your shoes and actually feel the ground and you feel everything, you can try doing bodyweight squats and feeling everything exactly how your feet should feel when you're doing your squat. And if you do that often enough, you can put on a pair of shoes, hopefully shoes that are a little bit flat soled, like a pair of Vans or some Chuck Taylors, or like the Adidas that I'm wearing here, or the Reeboks that I'm wearing here, shoes that have a thinner sole so that you can actually connect with the ground, and that'll help when you're trying to keep your heels against the ground. The next one is looking too far up into the sky when you're squatting, or looking way too far down. And the problem with both of these is that if you're looking too far down, it can actually knock you and roll you forward, and looking straight up into the sky can actually strain your neck and your spine. So we're gonna wanna keep our vision looking in one of two directions, either straight ahead of you or slightly ahead of you and at the floor. This is actually my preferred place to look when I'm squatting, is just slightly ahead of me and at the floor. But don't look directly at your feet. You don't want to do that. That's going to make you unbalanced and you could fall when you're doing that. The last mistake is dropping down too fast in your squat and having an uncontrolled concentric or eccentric portion of your squat. And the problem with that is that all of the other problems that we talked about, bucking with your hips, coming up on your toes, coming up on your heels, rounding your spine, all of those things have a higher likelihood of coming out when you're moving through your squats too quickly. But not only that, but you don't really properly get activation in your legs when you're moving through a movement too quickly. So it can be really beneficial to slow down the movement just a little bit, not do a complete pause at the bottom of the movement, and not go down for like a 4/4 tempo very, very slowly at a snail's pace when you're going down, but actually taking your time so that you're properly activating your quads and your glutes and your entirety of your legs when you're doing the movement. You'll get better results out of this, and you'll be doing the exercise in a much safer way that will decrease the chance of injury when you're squatting. All right, people, that does it for today's episode of Total Body Training. Question of the day: do you squat in your workouts right now? Let me know down in the comments section below. And if you don't squat, what do? Are you leg pressing? Are you doing lunges? What's the other movement that you're doing? Let me know in the comments section below. And if you'd like to help support Total Body Training, you can do it one of the following ways. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, and leave a comment in the comments section below. And if you'd like to go the extra mile, you can now purchase t-shirts, tank tops, and all sorts of goodies. Click the link in the description section of this video. It'll take you to our website where you can purchase your very own Total Body Training merch. As always, you can follow me, Jean Carlos, that's JeanCarlos TBT on Instagram, or you can follow Total Body Training on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. You've been watching Total Body Training. Until next time, peace.